series. Oftentimes it can seem as though God tells us more no's than yeses, and that is something we will discuss in today's talk, Is God Against My Freedom? We will touch on questions such as, does God want to keep me from enjoying the good things in life? Will labeling things off limits truly bring me happiness? And shouldn't I have the right to choose the way that I live? And here to talk today is Dr. Andy Bannister. He is an author and broadcaster and speaks across the US, Canada, and Europe. And he holds a PhD in Islamic studies from Brunel University, London, and teaches regularly on Islam and philosophy, and is a guest lecturer at Wycliffe Hall, University of Oxford. He's an author of a few books, including An Oral Formulaic Study of the Quran and The Atheist Who Didn't Exist, or The Dreadful Consequences of Bad Arguments. And he's currently the director of the Solas Centre for Public Christianity and an Adjunct Research Fellow at the Centre for the Study of Islam and Other Faiths at the Melbourne School of Theology. I'm really excited for this talk because last night I spent a good hour on his website reading some of his blog posts, so what he has to say should be really good. But before we begin, we do have a Q&A panel after this, so if you have questions throughout the talk, feel free to text that number and we'll try to address as many as possible, or write it down on your comment cards and we will respond to those shortly. Yes.
Okay, well, thank you for that welcome, and it's great to be here. In particular, it's great to be back here in Canada. For 6 years, Toronto was home, and then my family and I moved back to the UK in the summer. But last night when I flew into Pearson Airport, first time back in the city for 6 months, it does really feel like coming home. So it's great to be with you guys, great to be speaking on this first day of Mission Week. Now, the interesting thing is this: I now don't just live in the UK, I live in Scotland, the sort of northern end of the UK. And I confess, before I moved back to the UK in the summer, I didn't really know much about Scotland. I'd lived in London, I'd lived down the south of the country, and now I'm up in Scotland. In fact, the only thing I knew about Scotland before I moved there was the Braveheart movie. And Mel Gibson there playing the Scottish hero William Wallace with, of course, an Australian accent. I mean, what is it about Australian actors where Mel Gibson ruined William Wallace, and then, of course, Russell Crowe did Robin Hood a few years ago, as he's never ever been heard before or since. But if you've ever seen the movie Braveheart, it's a few years old now, but very, very famous and influential movie. There's a fascinating line in that movie, isn't there, about freedom. They may take our lives, but they may never take our freedom. That comes from a speech that Mel Gibson as William Wallace gives to the Scottish troops at the Battle of Stirling Bridge before they kick the living daylights out of the English. And I remember actually watching Braveheart the year it came out. I think it was 1996. And I was visiting a friend up in Edinburgh in Scotland, and we went to the cinema, and I think I was the only Englishman in the audience. And it was quite intimidating because every time an English soldier got chopped down, everybody would rise up and go, "Yes, kill the English!" And I'd sit at the back and go, "Yeah, I'm American," or something, and pretend I wasn't here. So freedom, though, is at the heart of that movie. They may take our lives, but they may never take our freedom. Freedom is a very, very powerful idea, isn't it? Especially in our culture. You know, in the culture that we live here in Canada, but the same would hold true for America or for Europe. Freedom is almost the supreme virtue that we've been told we need to live for. In fact, in terms of North America, there's a very, very well-regarded American sociologist called Robert Bellah. And a few decades ago, he did a study of North American culture. And he concluded that freedom was the chief virtue. He said for North Americans, freedom was perhaps the most important value in terms of what people think they're living for and aiming their lives at. And I suspect that many of us here, to be honest, would agree. You know, we think, don't we? We're told to think by our culture that freedom is important. We want to think that we can be free to make choices, free to choose our ethics, free to choose our beliefs, free to choose our friends, free to choose our relationships. Our culture teaches us daily through the media that choice is good, and the more choice, the better. Now, here's the interesting thing. Depending on what you believe here today, freedom can actually be a little bit problematic. For example, if you are an atheist or a skeptic or one of those type of worldviews here today, there's a bit of a problem, actually. For atheists in particular, freedom causes a problem. And the problem is this: if human beings are nothing more than atoms and particles banging around together, if there is no God, no supernatural, everything is just physics and chemistry, well, it's very hard to explain how freedom could in any meaningful way exist. It really would appear to be the case that you and I are just the deterministic results of physics and chemistry. Don't take my word for it. Take the word of one of the leading American atheists writing today. His name is Sam Harris. He sold books by the hundreds of thousands. And Sam writes this. He says, in fact, he said that the concept of free will is a non-starter, both philosophically and scientifically. There is simply no description of mental and physical causation that allows for the freedom that we claim for ourselves and we ascribe to others. Or take some words from our friends at the Centre for Naturalism, a very well-regarded atheist think tank. They went even further than Sam. They said we should doubt the little god of free will on the very same grounds that atheists doubt the big god of traditional religion. There is no evidence for it. Those are quite stark words. And quite bleak, really. What they're saying is if you're an atheist, you have a problem. There is no freedom. But if there's no freedom, some things follow. If there is no freedom, there is no moral accountability. If somebody commits rape, for example, they're just dancing to their DNA. If there is no freedom, there can't be love. You can't fall in love and give yourself to another person. You're just dancing to your DNA. And of course, if there is no freedom, there is no true thinking either, because you're not rationally weighing up the truth or the falsehood of an idea. You're just responding to the fizzing of chemicals in your brain. So I want to begin by suggesting to you this morning that if you care about freedom, if you think freedom is important, and the fact you have come to this talk suggests that you do, I want to suggest to you that you need to take seriously the idea that maybe you should consider becoming a Christian. Because I believe that only Christianity offers an actual base for freedom. And certainly atheism does not. Now, of course, at this point, I've brought religion into the conversation, and this is the point at which many people pop up and say, well, hang on a minute, Andy, now you're talking about God, and you're talking about religion, and this is the whole problem, isn't there? Because isn't God against my freedom? Isn't God against freedom? If I become a Christian, doesn't that mean that my will and my choices and my freedom and my desires, don't they have to be submitted to God? Isn't that what Christianity is all about? Don't, in fact, I have to choose? Don't I have to choose between my freedom and my autonomy and belief in God? Isn't it as stark as that? Well, I want to unpack some thoughts on that for you over the next 20 minutes or so. And I want to begin by saying the question of whether freedom and God go against each other, whether God is against your freedom, really depends on how you define freedom. Freedom is one of those very, very slippery words that we need to unpack what we mean. Now, in our culture, freedom has largely been explained this way. It's been defined as the absence of any constraint. On this definition, freedom means being able to do what I want to do, when I want to do it, with whom I want to do it. Nobody and nothing can tell me otherwise. That's the common view of freedom we hear in our culture. But there's a problem. In fact, I want to suggest there are a number of problems with that view of freedom, such that I think it is patently false, demonstrably unjust, and fundamentally self-destructive. So before we talk about God and freedom, let's begin by dismantling perhaps the very common cultural view of freedom that maybe many of you here this morning have, this has been the way you've thought about freedom before. What is the problem with suggesting that freedom means to be absolutely autonomous and not constrained by anything? Well, the first problem with this idea of freedom is it's utterly impossible. It's utterly impossible to actually live in such a way that freedom means not being constrained by anything. Why? Well, for this reason. The first problem is that our desires conflict. For example, I want to be free to eat as many Tim Hortons Boston cream donuts as I possibly can. It's one of the biggest things I miss about Canada, and one of the things I rectify every time I come back to this great country of yours. I want to be free to enjoy as many donuts as possible. In fact, the Tim Hortons share price plummeted when I left in July, quite frankly, I think. I want that freedom. But here's the thing. I also want to be free to be able to run a mile in under 6 minutes. I want to improve my mile time. Do you see the problem? Those two desires conflict. I cannot achieve both. If I enjoy every donut that presents itself to me, I may be driving a mile in 6 minutes, maybe not in the 401, but I shan't be running one at that speed. There's a problem. And thus Tim Keller, whose work I'm drawing on a little bit for this talk, puts it nicely. He says, there is not then just one thing called freedom that we either have or we don't have. At the level of lived life, there are numerous freedoms, and nobody can have them all. So what we have to do, my friends, is we have to decide which freedom is the most important and which others I need to sacrifice. If I want to meet my goal of being able to run a mile in something close to 6 minutes, I am going to have to choose to sacrifice, to curtail my freedom of eating every donut I see every time I pass a Tim Hortons. And there are now 3,984 of them here in Canada, I believe. And that dilemma gets us to the heart of something important. Real freedom is not the absence of constraint. Real freedom is not the absence of constraint. Real freedom is the right constraint. Choosing the restrictions that lead to flourishing and leading to the right kind of life. Now, okay, you say at this point, well, that's great. That means it comes down to me, right? I get to choose which freedoms I want and which freedoms I give up. It's still me, 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 and we're still playing around with autonomy. But again, I say, well, I'm afraid, no, it's not that simple. Because when you try and balance this out, you bang up against the real world. You see, however much I might insist that my choice is to eat donuts, and I want to also choose to be able to run, my body is going to have other ideas. I will run up against the limits of being 44 and fundamentally lazy. Thank you, one person who laughed rather too loudly. I saw who you were. And the interesting thing is this. This leads to perhaps the most important question here. What are we designed for? This is the question we're going to hit a couple of times in this talk. What are we actually designed for primarily? See, one of my hobbies is drone flying. I discovered this about 18 months ago. It's a great way to take beautiful landscape photographs and also stalk people from 500 meters. Now, the instructions that came with my $1,800 drone say explicitly, do not fly it in enclosed spaces. Among enclosed spaces are listed things like buildings and bridges, and woods in particular are quite devastating to drones. Well, over Christmas, I decided it would be quite fun to go flying in the woods near where my parents lived, and I hit a tree. And I crashed my $1,800 drone into an oak tree and almost wrote it off. I was very, very lucky. In other words, I had broken the instructions. I had tried to use it to do something it wasn't designed for, and I damaged it. And I want to suggest to you the same goes for human life. And that raises the question, what were we designed for? And how do we find the right kind of constraints? How do we live the right kind of life that means we will flourish rather than damage ourselves and each other? We'll come back to that thought at the end. So the first problem with defining freedom as radical autonomy is it's impossible in practice. Secondly, is that it's incredibly selfish. Second problem is it's incredibly selfish. What do I mean by that? Well, the idea that we can be absolutely autonomous simply doesn't work because it ignores the fact that we are dependent on others. The idea that freedom is just about you and your choices ignores the fact that you are reliant upon everyone from your parents, to the teachers who taught you at school, to the police, to the doctors, to those who supply power and gas to our homes, to those who supply our food and clean our streets and bring Boston cream delivery to Tim Hortons. The list goes on and on. I can't live as an independent, autonomous unit. I am dependent on others. And it also ignores, of course, the fact that I have others dependent on me. I mean, sure, I could choose to exercise my freedom radically and autonomously, and I could choose to abandon my wife and my 2 small children, run off to Mexico, and run a bar on the beach for the next 10 years. But that choice would be incredibly selfish, because it would have a huge impact on those who depend on me. And I put it to you, if you heard me say that I was seriously thinking of doing that, you wouldn't be sitting there thinking, wow, that's freedom. You'd be sitting there thinking, what an arrogant, selfish, insert expletive of your choice at the end of the sentence. You see, this is something that our modern view of freedom tries hard to get us to think about, forget thinking about rather, but we need to take seriously. We are interconnected, and we do not exercise our freedom in a vacuum. So, radical freedom, the idea of freedom is the freedom to do entirely what you want. It's impossible in practice. It's incredibly selfish. Thirdly, it needs to be balanced with some other principles. And one of the principles it needs to be balanced with, I think, is the principle of doing no harm to others. I think most of us, most of the time, understand this. If I exercise my freedom to walk over and pick up a hammer from the side of the lecture hall and then go to the back and find one of the lovely people serving you pizza and beat them around the head with a hammer, you would have said the problem, Andy, is that you've now used your freedom to inflict harm. And most of us in a country like Canada and in the West have it in sort of on our heads that, okay, you can be free to do what you want as long as you shouldn't harm other people. That sounds very simple. But like all things that sound simple, it gets complex very quickly. Who decides what harm is? I mean, hitting someone with a hammer, easy to decide, but what about something far more complex? There are far more complex issues out there in society around what harm is and what human flourishing looks like. How do we decide? And so while it's pretty obvious that freedom of choice cannot really be our supreme virtue or guide to life, because we need to have some moral constraints on our actions, what those constraints are, that is a whole other discussion. But I put it to you that freedom cannot be the chief virtue here today. Something deeper has to be going on. So freedom is impossible in practice, radical freedom. It's selfish, it needs balancing with deeper principles. Fourthly, I also want to suggest to you that the problem with construing freedom as being autonomously entirely free is it destroys relationships. What do I mean by that? Well, to be in a relationship, you need to be committed to the other person, don't you? And you need to sacrifice some of your freedom for that relationship to work. I've been married to my wife for 18 years. She probably deserves some kind of long service medal, quite frankly. But, you know, when I got married back in 1998, I discovered a number of things very quickly. And one of the things I discovered very, very quickly was that being married was very different from being single. Very different from being single. For example, I discovered quite quickly that I could no longer do wholly what I wanted without telling anybody. I discovered that if I chose to stay late with my friends at the pub and I didn't tell my wife I wasn't going to be home until 11:30, I got grief when I came through the door. That was news to me as a newly married man. I also discovered that if I go out and spend hundreds of dollars on a new Apple product and don't tell my wife I was planning on using our joint bank account to do that, there were problems. And much of this had to be negotiated over the first couple of years of our marriage. Now, of course, it gets more complicated because my wife and I have children. And, of course, it's even more the case. To be a good parent, have a good relationship with my kids, means sacrificing my freedom. It means putting their needs first. And what that tells me is this. It tells me that you cannot be free in the way that our culture tells us that we should be trying to be free and be in a close, loving relationship with somebody else. If you want a close, loving relationship, you are going to have to make sacrifices of your freedom. You are going to have to curtail and constrain your freedom. And if you don't, you are going to have a very lonely, sad existence. Now, is that price of freedom worth paying? Yes, I think it is. I've sacrificed and given up significant freedom. And I have a good marriage, I have a good relationship with my kids. Yeah, I don't feel abused. I don't feel that I've lost something. In fact, I've gained something. And again, I want to suggest to you that freedom, in the way that our culture defines it as the absence of all constraints, is a very, very unhelpful way of looking at the freedom question. And if we misunderstand freedom, we are going to have problems when it comes to the question of freedom and God. And then lastly, and then I'm going to connect this to the Christian faith for you, being told 5 minutes, or maybe more like 10, just to warn you. That leads to my fifth observation. See, they're putting constraints on my time as a speaker. Look at this, it's terrible. These are my fifth observation, and that's that the way that our culture defines freedom as the absence of all constraints is a very thin view of freedom. A very, very thin view of freedom, and particularly it doesn't tell you how you should be using your freedom. I imagine many of you will have seen a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago now, there's a wonderful movie came out, a great science fiction movie called Gravity. Anyone here see that movie? Many of you? Several of you? A few of you? Not enough sci-fi fans. There are some nerds in the house. Fantastic. Okay, well, in that movie, partway through that movie, there's a scene in which the astronaut Matt Kowalski, played by George Clooney, is left stranded in space. His suit out of fuel. He's not tethered to the space station, and he dies. To break it to you, haven't seen it. There we are. Spoilers for you. Now, here's the thing. Is he free up until this point? Well, yeah, right. He has no constraints. He's not tied to anything. There's no little rocket boosters pushing him around. He is utterly, completely free, not even constrained by gravity. But here's the question. Can he do anything? No. He is absolutely, utterly helpless. It's meaningless. His freedom is meaningless. He's free from constraints, but he is not free to do anything. And you see, many philosophers have pointed out that this is a very important point we need to be thinking about, my friends. It's one thing to talk about freedom from, but we also need to talk about freedom to. Freedom from is negative freedom. Freedom to is positive freedom. You see, our culture sees freedom as the highest good, but our culture is afraid of telling you what your freedom should be used for. What should you be committed to? What is it worth giving your life to? What causes, what things should you be investing your time and your energy and your commitment in? Unless you can answer those questions, then I'm afraid talk of freedom is mere sophistry. There has to be more to freedom than simply the freedom to be left alone to do what you want, or the freedom to choose from a dozen varieties of donuts next time you walk into a Tim Hortons. And I think that's a huge question to think about. But there's an even deeper one that I want to just spend my last 5 minutes on, and then we'll head this into a time of Q&A. The last thing I want us to think about for a few minutes is this, that none of us here are actually free. Nobody is actually free because all of us are serving something. Every single one of us is serving something. Whether you're a Christian or you're not, that goes for you in this room today. All of you here are living for something. Think of it this way. Maybe you're living for academic grades, and your life is all about the grades you get in your exams and your essays. Maybe you're living for a particular relationship. There's that person who is everything to you. Maybe you're living for your career, or for your bank balance, or for your popularity, or for sporting success, or for some hobby that you're passionate about. The thing you're living for is a thing that gets you out of bed in the morning. The thing that if it wasn't there in your life would not be worth living. All of us have that, if we are honest with ourselves. It will be different for each one of us. But I wonder if it's occurred to you that the thing that you are living for, the thing that is the object of your meaning, your purpose, your satisfaction, and your joy, ultimately controls you. Very famous novelist, postmodern novelist, David Foster Wallace, who, if we have any literature grads here, will no doubt have heard of Wallace. Not a Christian, as far as I know, but a few years before his death in 2008, he wrote one of the most insightful things I have seen on this subject. Let me read you a very famous paragraph from an essay he wrote. Wallace writes, "In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshipping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And an outstanding reason for choosing some sort of god or spiritual type of thing to worship is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you find real meaning in life, then you will never have enough. Never feel that you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die 1,000,000 deaths before they finally plant you. Worship power, and you will feel weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over others to keep that fear at bay. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, and you will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out, and so on." What Wallace is nudging at here is that whatever is the source of your meaning and your joy, whatever it is that you're living for, well, the thing about it is you have to have it. You have to have it, and the moment you don't have it, the moment you're afraid of losing it, then comes anxiety and nervousness and depression and fear and all kinds of things. And because of that, no matter what you're living for, whether it's your academic reputation, that relationship, your bank balance, your popularity, your success, your beauty, it will end up controlling you. It has basically become your God. As Tim Keller put it, if there is no God, he says, you will have to turn around. You have to turn some created thing into a God to worship. And whatever that thing is, it will punish you with inner fears and resentment and guilt and shame if you fail to achieve it. And I know what he's speaking of here because I learned that lesson myself in my early 20s when I was first in the world of work, and I got onto this idea that it was really through success at work, through money, through popularity, through being the boss's favorite, that was where meaning in life was to be found. And in my case, it led to a near nervous breakdown, 3 months on antidepressants and stress-related, all kinds of things before I got my life reorientated. You see, the problem is that if you end up making your career, your academics, your success, or any of these things your God, it ultimately, at some point, you will fail. You will trip up. And then it will end up crucifying you inside with anxiety and hatred and jealousy and self-loathing. The thing that you worship will destroy you. It will crucify you. By contrast, at the heart of the Christian faith stands the news that Jesus, by contrast, was crucified for you. See, if you follow Jesus, if you become a Christian, will there be constraints? Will it impact your freedom? Well, yes, it will. But then, as we've seen, everybody lives for something. Everybody lives for something, and the thing that you're living for here today has already impacted your freedom. It is already your master. It's already telling you what to do. The question is not, can I live my life free of constraints, and can I avoid serving something? All of us here in this room serve something. The question is, who will you serve? Who will you serve? And are the constraints on your life the right one? You see, if there is a God, and I believe that there is, if there is a God and he made you, he designed you, he created you, he loves you, he wants the very best for you, and thus he knows what is best for you. And living for God means becoming what we were meant to be, becoming fully human. You know, the closest analogy, in conclusion, that I know to being a Christian is falling in love. When you grasp what Jesus has done for you, how he paid that tremendous price for you, giving up his freedom, giving up his security, humbling himself on the cross, even to death on a cross. When you grasp that, it makes you want to respond out of love and gratitude. And as we saw earlier, falling in love means a loss of independence. And falling in love only works if both parties in the relationship are willing to give up some of their freedom. Otherwise, there can't be a relationship. Otherwise, there's exploitation, quite frankly. But the wonderful news of the gospel is that Jesus has done this already. He took the initiative. Jesus died for you before you responded, while he was still his enemy, showing his love for you even while you were far from him. Jesus laid down his freedom when he was nailed onto the cross that first Easter, so that we might know life's true purpose in a relationship with God. And now Jesus looks at each of us, each of you, and says, I have given up my freedom. I have laid down my freedom so that a relationship might be possible. Are you willing to lay down yours and discover what a relationship with a God like that looks like? See, in the Bible, in Matthew chapter 11, Jesus says these words, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm humble and gentle in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." You can choose to serve your career, your sexuality, your image, and your performance. Pick any of those things, and those things will ultimately destroy you. They promise freedom, but they actually offer you servitude. Or you can choose to worship, you can choose to serve the one who created you, the one who, rather than laden you down with more and more burdens, has taken up our burdens, the one who looks at you and says, not merely do I know what you were intended to be, because I made you, but the one who looks at you and says, if you fail and you stumble and you make a mistake, I won't break you, but I will offer you forgiveness. And thus, ladies and gentlemen, the gospel, the good news of what Jesus has done, offers us, I believe, the only true freedom. Thank you for listening. So patiently.
Hello? Okay, so before we move into the Q&A, we do have a student story to play. This is Stephen, he's a second year, and he'll be sharing kind of how God has been working in his life.
Hi, my name is Stephen, and I've been struggling with a pornography addiction for most of my teenage years and into my adult life. And I'm in recovery now, but it's still a challenge every day. And if I've learned anything from this, it's that you can be addicted to pretty much anything and become a slave to that thing. And I'm not talking about, slavery in the traditional physical sense, but slavery of the mind and of the heart and of the spirit. And that makes it so much more powerful when people ask me things like, does God really care about my freedom? Because it comes out as a resounding yes, of course he does. We talk about obedience to God, and we talk about obedience all throughout the Bible, and people think this is the same sort of obedience to something that you're addicted to, or something that you have to do because you're enslaved to it. But it's not. This is the type of obedience that is life-giving and changes the way you look at things. When I'm obedient to God, I'm focused on him. And he changes the way I see the world. Things that could have been addictive before, video games, food, Netflix even, you know? These things are reframed and reshaped in this context. You know, they can be good, they can be beneficial, they're gifts for us. You know, sex is a gift to us, but we have to use it correctly. And, you know, if God's taught me anything, it's that without Him, and without Him taking us out of our addictions and out of our slavery, you know, we would be stuck in that, chained to one thing or another for our entire lives. But it is only through God and it is only through Christ who came down to us that I can say that I am no longer a slave, but I am now a son.